Hi, I'm Bob Goldberg, and I'm speaking here today with Steve Berk, a columnist with Hipfish, and an emeritus professor from Cal State University at Long Beach, and also now currently on the College Board at Classic Community College. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
And today we're going to talk about the Occupy movement, and Steve has written an article for the November issue of Hipfish, which will be out in a few days, and it's called Power to the People, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's about the Occupy movement. So I thought we'd talk about today a couple things. First, how did the Occupy movement come about, and what's its roots?
The Occupy movement is, to my way of thinking, the most exciting movement that we've had since my youth. In fact, in many ways, it's a more significant movement than the movements we had in the 60s. The Occupy movement is the result of 30 years of what's known as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the return to a laissez-faire, unregulated form of capitalism that began in earnest in the Reagan administration, but the beginnings of the deregulation of banking began in the Carter administration. What we've had is 30 years of what is popularly known as globalization. That's this unregulated capitalism dominated by finance capital and moving of pools of money all over the world, hedge funds and so on, and the turning of the stock market into an international gambling casino. This has been accompanied by the race to the bottom, and that's an important thing to understand. That's the outsourcing of jobs from countries like this one in particular, which had strong unions and that paid benefits, retirements, living wage, family wage, jobs, outsourcing of jobs and industry to countries where there are not only no environmental regulations, which cost corporations more, but there are, labor is paid pennies a day and labor unions are banned. These are usually authoritarian regimes, and you've seen them in parts of Asia. And of course, China has become the big producer for the world at this point. Transnational corporations have outgrown countries. They have formed international organizations, in particular the WTO, a World Trade Organization. Those countries, the WTO can trump individual nation states. For example, give you one example. Canada had an additive they put in gasoline that was not allowed in California and certain other parts of the United States. Canada went to the WTO when they were prevented from adding this form of, putting this additive in gas in the United States, and the WTO declared that the U.S. must accept it. If the U.S. didn't accept it, it would be sanctioned. There would be various kinds of trade sanctions against the U.S. This goes on throughout the world. So you've got these big globalized organizations that represent the free trade regimen, which also embodies a laissez-faire form of capitalism, an unregulated form of capitalism, which races to the bottom. And what you've got is what Karl Marx once predicted when he said way back in the 19th century that eventually a few people would have most of the money and the vast majority of people would be thrown into the proletariat. When I was growing up, when you were growing up, we were told that Marx was wrong because we had the welfare state, because we had labor unions now recognized, because labor could make a living wage, because the world economy was rising and there was a growth in the middle class and a growth in benefits and a growth in welfare statism. But see, since the early 80s with Reaganism and Thatcherism and Clintonism and so on, and it really isn't the presidents that have much to do with this, it's the economic titans who stand behind them who are kind of faceless. That's all been taken away. You have no welfare statism anymore. What's happening as a result of this great meltdown caused by this over-speculation in banking? When you deregulate banking, you end up with over-speculation like you had in the 20s. That's why the Glass-Steagall Act was put in place. The Glass-Steagall Act in the 1930s, in the New Deal era, put a firewall between commercial banking, that's banking to you and me and mom and pop. It's the banking that is characterized by the building and loan in It's a Wonderful Life, which, by the way, it might be a Frank Capra movie that's sentimental, but it's got an interesting economic message, which was a message of that time. George Bailey's building and loan was to get mom and pop into a home that was government, where the government saw to it that financing was easily available to the people at large, where nobody was profiteering. That was done with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, with the Federal Housing Administration, with the Farmers Home Administration. All of these things were ways of regulating banking and getting people into homes. There was regulation over monopoly in the economy too. That began in the early part of the 20th century. And that kept a few giant corporations from dominating any one industry. That's been done away with also. We have monopoly capital today. We have, for example, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, passed in the Clinton administration, enabled 7 corporations, I think it is, or maybe less now, to control most of media. And so this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get the truth from mainstream media, because of it's controlled by transnational corporations.
So I wanted to know, Steve, if all of this history has occurred, why the Occupy movement now? I mean, why didn't we have it 3 years ago? Why did the Tea Party movement come first?
Things have come to a head. Well, you know, a few years ago, you know, people will look to political leaders to help them, to save them. You know, 2008, you had the economic meltdown. So remember that the original meltdown in the 20s, as a result of the deregulation of everything at that time and the over-speculation that occurred then as a result of investment banking or highly speculative banking being put together with commercial banking in what was then, for example, called First National City Bank of New York, which is now Citicorp, which used to be run by Robert Rubin and then Larry Summers, and now who knows. And they're another one of these banks like Goldman Sachs. And essentially, we are now, let's see, the 2008 is when the meltdown occurred. That would be equivalent of 1929. The depth of the Depression occurred about 1932. We were just about that point. And we've got this huge amount of unemployment, and government is hamstrung by being beholden to the 1%. We've also had these outrageous Supreme Court decisions that they hadn't had in the 30s, although the court was a problem in the 30s, and Roosevelt had to fight the court in order for many of his New Deal programs to be carried out. But we've now got this horrendous Citizens United decision, which is the product of a whole number of decisions, not only granting corporations personhood, but making them the rulers, essentially, the kingpins, the constituents. You know, the whole point of the American Revolution was what Robert Palmer, the great historian of Age of Democratic Revolution, called the people as a constituent power. The U.S. was the country that brought that into being. It was sustained in the French Revolution and other revolutions. The people as a constituent power, that is to say, popular sovereignty. The people can choose their own government. What was done, here was the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Amendment, which was put in after the Civil War to give citizenship to former slaves, African Americans. The court used it not to give citizenship to African Americans who were later denied most of their rights under the so-called equal protection, under the so-called separate but equal concept of Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s. But they use the Equal Protection Clause in this really twisted way to give personhood to corporations. And that's been done in a whole number of cases. Most recently, the two big ones in our time are Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976, where the court said that money in campaigns, which had been, money had been limited in campaigns, personal money, after Watergate. There were reforms. Because the committee to re-elect the president, CREEP, the Republican committee that was formed to re-elect President Nixon, a lot of people's personal money was put into campaigns. So there was campaign finance reform done after Watergate. It was a moderate campaign finance reform, but that was challenged in Buckley versus Vallejo, and the court at that time said that money in campaigns cannot be restricted. It was equal to free speech. That was personal money. Then there was the very mild and moderate McCain-Feingold reform of recent years that tried to get people to identify who they were who were contributing to campaigns, that tried to say that certain kinds of money could not be put in campaigns. That was thrown out. The Citizens United case basically said that any entity, could be the Ku Klux Klan, could be China, foreign government, anybody, secretly, without even revealing who they are, can put any amount of money in a political campaign if they want. And so what does that do? It strips away the whole concept of the people as the constituent power. Congress and the legislatures then become the pawns of these huge aggregates of capital, or these various nefarious influences that are seeking to influence them, rather than the people of the given